Now, what Manischewitz does, though, that's so successful, I can just continue this story, is that by the 1950s, it's developed a whole new market, and that's the African American market. And by the mid 80s, the estimates is that 80% of Manishewitz's customers were African Americans. They crossed over the African American market. They advertised heavily in those areas there. And what's interesting is how important the kosher designation was to African American consumers in the 1950s as a sign of quality, as a sign of the value of this. And also for African Americans religious, that it was a wine that had a sacramental purpose. It wasn't just for drinking. So that's in a way where their big sales come in the 50s, 60s, 70s, is actually outside of the Jewish community.
Now, I remember in the book chapter you mentioned there was a similar type of grape in the south of the U.S. that many of them have been familiar with that was very similar to the Concord grape that you needed to add sugar, right?
Yes.
That contributed to that?
Yeah, there's a very old, there are grapes that are domestic to the area which is we now call the United States. Not French grapes, but these are domestic grapes. One of them is the Concord grape, which is which is refined in the 19th century. The older one is something called Scuppernong grapes, which is Scuppernong. It's a very funny name, which is actually refined from something called muscadine grapes. That's domestic grape. And the importance of these were tough grapes. The French grapes all died in the 1880s, 1890s. A terrible, terrible plague. These grapes were tough. And the reason they worked as wine is because they were acidic, they didn't die, and frankly, the Scuppernong grapes, they just grew wild in the South. And you could collect these things, you put them on arbors, and the wine goes back to Jamestown, 1607, where Jamestown made wine out of these grapes. So that's a very old grape, very important among African Americans in the 19th and the 20th century. A lot of home production, a lot of sweet wine. Like Concord, the Scuppernongs are acidic. It's hard to turn acidic grapes into wine. To do that, you have to dump all sorts of sugar into these wines to make the fermentation work and to make them palatable. And the recipes for Scuppernong wine, say around 1880, are the same recipes as for Concord grape wine, kosher wine in the 1920s. Similar amounts of sugar, very similar recipes. So the African Americans moved to the north, especially after World War II, to take jobs. Places like New York City, they settled in Harlem, where there's already a lot of Jews. There are grassroots demand for Manischewitz develops in the 40s that Meyer Robinson of the Monarch Wine Company, he's only too happy to have these sales for Manischewitz wine, especially because when he advertises it, he's advertising it as kosher wine under the Manischewitz name. And there's nothing ambiguous about Manischewitz when it comes to being Jewish. Let's just say it. That name is clearly Jewish. Yeah.
And then, of course, the Bartenura, the Moscato d'Asti, then also has a crossover appeal, right? To not just the Jewish community. It has a broader appeal.
Right. Well, the Bartenura Moscato, to me, it just emulates the success of Manischewitz. It's it's not the same, but there's a lot of similarities. And the Moscato that they produce is, I understand, it's a good Moscato. I mean, I don't particularly like Moscato wine, so I can't really judge that. But it's a relatively low alcohol wine. It's 6 or 7% alcohol. It's sparkling. It's light. And for reasons that I don't think anybody really knows, it became very popular among the hip hop generation of stars. That's not what their plan was. They made Moscato because they knew that they wanted to generate a larger brand appeal. But like the Robinsons who ran Manischewitz, David Herzog and his people see the opportunity there, and then start marketing it towards the hip-hop community. And it's a huge, huge success. I think a couple of years ago, it sold 1 million bottles of wine. 1 million bottles of wine. And like Manischewitz, I mean, the vast majority of consumers are not Jewish for that reason. So they have had a huge breakthrough with that. And financially, of course, it's meant a lot of resources for them. And that's probably the largest selling Jewish or kosher wine today is Bartenura Moscato.